The morning mist clung to the towering pines of Blackwood Forest like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip as the first pale rays of dawn filtered through the canopy. Ranger Sarah Chen adjusted her radio on her belt and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, savoring the familiar scent of pine needles and damp earth that had become her sanctuary over the past 8 years. At 34, she had seen enough search and rescue operations to know that the wilderness could be both beautiful and merciless, often within the span of a single heartbeat. Her partner, Marcus Torres, emerged from the ranger station carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee, his weathered face already showing the concern that had been etched there since the call came in at dawn. At 47, Marcus had 23 years of experience in these mountains, and Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of his worry like a barometer of danger. "Still no word from the Henderson party?" Sarah asked, accepting the coffee gratefully. The ceramic mug warmed her hands against the early morning chill that never quite left these elevations, even in late summer. Marcus shook his head, his dark eyes scanning the tree line that stretched endlessly in all directions around their small outpost. "Radio silence since yesterday afternoon. They were supposed to check in at Devil's Backbone Overlook by 1800 hours. He paused to sip his coffee, the steam rising between them like an ominous portent. "That's 14 hours ago now." The Henderson family had registered for a 3-day backcountry camping permit on Thursday morning. Tom Henderson, his wife Linda, and their 19-year-old son Jake had seemed well prepared and experienced when Sarah processed their paperwork. Tom had been hiking these mountains for over a decade, and his detailed itinerary had impressed her with its realistic timing and safety margins. They planned to follow the Serpentine Trail deep into the heart of Blackwood Forest, where ancient cedars grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor even at noon. Sarah pulled out the topographical map and spread it across the hood of their patrol vehicle, weighing down the corners with stones to prevent the mountain breeze from snatching it away. The Serpentine Trail was marked in red ink, winding like a crimson snake through contour lines that indicated increasingly treacherous terrain. The trail began innocuously enough, following an old logging road for the first 5 miles, before branching off into single track that climbed steadily through dense timber and across several creek crossings that could become impassable during the frequent afternoon thunderstorms. "They should have made camp somewhere around here," Marcus said, pointing to a cluster of established campsites near Bear Creek, about 12 miles from the trailhead. If they stayed on schedule, that would put them at the overlook yesterday afternoon for their scheduled check-in. The Devil's Backbone Overlook was a rocky promontory that offered spectacular views of the valley below, but was also notorious for its exposure to sudden weather changes. Sarah had conducted 2 rescues there in the past 3 years, both involving hikers caught off guard by the violent thunderstorms that could materialize seemingly from nowhere in these mountains. "Weather report?" she asked, though she could already feel the atmospheric pressure shifting around them like a living thing. Marcus consulted his phone, frowning at the display. "Storm system moving in from the west. Could hit us by late afternoon, possibly sooner. If they're still out there." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Both rangers knew that exposure was the silent killer in these mountains, claiming more lives than bear attacks, falls, and all other wilderness hazards combined. Sarah folded the map carefully and secured it in her pack alongside the other essential equipment that might mean the difference between life and death in the coming hours. Emergency medical supplies, GPS units, extra batteries, emergency shelter materials, high-energy food and water purification tablets. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden as she mentally reviewed the search protocols they would follow. The radio crackled to life, startling them both. "Base to Ranger Chen, come in." The voice belonged to Rebecca Walsh, the dispatcher who coordinated all emergency services for the 3-county area that included Blackwood Forest. Sarah keyed the microphone. "Chen here. Go ahead, Base." "We've got another missing hiker report. Single male, David Reeves, age 32, failed to return from a day hike yesterday. Vehicle still parked at the Pine Ridge trailhead. His emergency contact says he was planning to photograph wildflowers along the ridge trail." Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances. Pine Ridge trailhead was only 6 miles from where the Henderson family had begun their journey, and the trails intersected at several points deeper in the forest. Two separate incidents so close together was unusual but not unprecedented during peak hiking season. "Any connection to the Henderson party?" Sarah asked. "Negative. Different itineraries, different timelines, but the Pine Ridge Trail does cross the Serpentine at Miller's Gap." Miller's Gap was a saddle between two peaks where several trails converged, creating a natural bottleneck for hikers traveling deeper into the wilderness. It was also a place where inexperienced hikers frequently became disoriented, especially when weather conditions reduced visibility. "Copy that, base. We're preparing to deploy for search operations on both incidents. RTA to Pine Ridge Trailhead approximately 30 minutes. Roger. I'm coordinating with County Search and Rescue. They'll have a team standing by if you need additional resources." Sarah clipped the radio back to her belt and began the methodical process of checking her gear one final time. Her backpack contained enough supplies for a potential overnight operation, though she hoped they would locate the missing hikers before darkness made the search exponentially more dangerous. Marcus was performing his own equipment check with the practiced efficiency of a man who had learned that forgetting a single essential item could cost lives. His pack was heavier than Sarah's, containing additional rescue equipment including ropes, a portable stretcher, and medical supplies that went beyond basic first aid. "Something feels wrong about this," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone that Sarah had rarely heard in all their years as partners. Two separate incidents, both experienced hikers, both in areas they should know well. Sarah paused in her preparations. Marcus's instincts had saved them more than once during their partnership, and she had learned never to dismiss his concerns lightly. "What are you thinking?" "Could be coincidence," he admitted, shouldering his pack and testing the weight distribution. "But I've been working these mountains for over 2 decades, and experienced hikers don't just vanish without a trace, not two separate parties in less than 24 hours. The morning sun had climbed higher while they prepared, burning off some of the mist and revealing the true scale of the wilderness that surrounded them. Blackwood Forest stretched for over 200,000 acres of primitive backcountry, much of it roadless and accessible only on foot. The terrain ranged from gentle meadows dotted with wildflowers to vertical cliff faces that challenged even experienced rock climbers. Hidden within this vast expanse were countless places where a lost hiker could disappear completely, their calls for help swallowed by the dense timber and rugged topography. They climbed into the patrol vehicle, a modified pickup truck, equipped with 4-wheel drive and additional ground clearance for navigating the primitive roads that provided access to the more remote trailheads. The engine echoed off the surrounding mountains as Marcus navigated the winding dirt road that would take them to Pine Ridge. The forest pressed close on both sides of the narrow track, creating a tunnel of green shadow that seemed to swallow sound and light with equal efficiency. Sarah found herself studying the tree line, looking for any sign of movement or disturbance that might indicate human presence. The deeper they traveled into the wilderness, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the rumble of their engine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling high overhead. "Pull over here," Sarah said as they approached a wide spot in the road where they could safely park without blocking access for other emergency vehicles. They walked the final quarter-mile to Pine Ridge Trailhead, their boots crunching on the gravel path that had been carved from the mountainside decades earlier by the Civilian Conservation Corps. The trailhead parking area was small, designed to accommodate perhaps a dozen vehicles at most, and David Reeves's blue Honda Civic sat alone in the morning shadows like an abandoned monument to plans gone wrong. Sarah peered through the car's windows while Marcus examined the trail register, where hikers were supposed to record their intended routes and expected return times. The vehicle's interior revealed the typical detritus of a day hiker: empty water bottles, energy bar wrappers, a folded topographical map, and the expensive-looking camera bag in the back seat. "He signed in yesterday at 07:30, Marcus called from the wooden register box mounted on a post near the trail entrance. Planned route was the Ridge Trail Loop, estimated return time 1,600 hours. That's almost 18 hours overdue. The Ridge Trail was considered moderate difficulty, a 6-mile loop that climbed steadily through mixed forest before breaking above the tree line for spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. On a clear day, an experienced hiker could complete the loop in 4 to 5 hours, leaving plenty of time to return before dark. David Reeves had allowed himself over 8 hours, suggesting he planned to take his time photographing the wildflowers that would be at their peak in the high meadows. Sarah shouldered her pack and checked her GPS unit, marking their current position as a waypoint before they began their ascent. The trail began innocuously enough, following a well-maintained path through mixed conifer forest where the morning light filtered through the canopy in shafts of golden illumination. Bird calls echoed from the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance a stream gurgled over granite boulders worn smooth by centuries of mountain runoff. But as they climbed higher, the character of the forest began to change subtly. The trees grew taller and closer together, their branches interweaving overhead to create an increasingly dense canopy that blocked out more and more of the sky. The understory became thicker, filled with deadfall and brambles that would make travel difficult for anyone who strayed from the established trail. After 45 minutes of steady climbing, they reached the first major trail junction where the ridge trail branched off from the main path. Sarah consulted her map while Marcus examined the ground for any signs of recent passage. The trail surface was a mixture of packed earth and granite gravel that held footprints poorly, but Marcus's trained eye caught details that most people would miss entirely. "Fresh boot prints heading up the ridge trail," he reported, kneeling to examine the faint impressions in a patch of soft earth beside a seasonal creek crossing. Men's hiking boots, size 10 or 11, probably within the last 24 hours based on the condition of the edges. Sarah felt a small surge of relief. At least they were on the right track. David Reeves had made it this far and had been following his planned route, but as they continued climbing toward the ridge, that relief began to fade as the forest around them seemed to press closer with each step, and the familiar sounds of wildlife gradually fell silent until only their own breathing and footsteps remained to mark their passage through the increasingly ominous wilderness. The ridge trail climbed steadily for another mile before the first signs of trouble emerged. Sarah spotted it first, a piece of bright orange fabric caught on a low branch about 20 feet off the established trail, fluttering like a distress flag in the mountain breeze. She called Marcus over, and they both examined the fragment without touching it, years of training having taught them to preserve potential evidence until they understood what they were dealing with. "Looks like it came from a daypack or jacket," Marcus observed, studying the weave and color. "Recent, too. Weather hasn't had time to fade it." Sarah used her camera to document the location, taking multiple shots from different angles, while Marcus examined the surrounding area for additional clues. The ground sloped away steeply from the trail at this point, covered with loose scree and fallen logs that would make travel treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with mountain terrain. "No obvious signs he went down this way," Marcus reported after a careful examination of the slope. "But if he was chasing a shot of wildflowers and stepped off trail..." They both knew how easily it could happen. A photographer focused on capturing the perfect image might take just a few steps off the established path, then a few more until suddenly the trail was no longer visible, and panic set in. The forest had a way of swallowing sounds and distorting distances, making it nearly impossible for a disoriented hiker to find their way back to safety. They continued climbing, now moving more slowly, and scanning the forest on both sides of the trail for any additional signs of David Reeves's passage. The air grew thinner as they gained elevation, and Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing with the combination of altitude and growing anxiety about what they might find. The trail switched back sharply as it approached the ridge, and with each turn, the forest seemed to grow more oppressive. Ancient trees towered overhead, their massive trunks disappearing into shadows that daylight never fully penetrated. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the branches and the distant sound of running water from some unseen creek far below. At the ridge crest, the trail opened into a series of alpine meadows dotted with the wildflowers that David Reeves had come to photograph. Under different circumstances, the scene would have been breathtaking. Waves of purple lupine and Indian paintbrush rolling across the mountainside beneath a canopy of endless blue sky. But today, the beauty felt ominous, like a beautiful trap waiting to spring. Sarah's radio crackled to life, startling her from her contemplation of the meadows. Base to Ranger Chen, over. Chen here. We've got an update on the Henderson family. Their vehicle was found this morning at the Serpentine trailhead, but there's something odd. Local law enforcement is requesting you respond to that location when you complete your current search. What kind of odd? Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Vehicle shows signs of forced entry. Camping gear appears to have been removed, but personal items were left behind. Detective Morrison is en route to process the scene. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. A simple search and rescue operation was suddenly becoming something much more sinister. She looked at Marcus, who had been monitoring the radio conversation, and saw her own fears reflected in his weathered face. Copy, base. We'll complete our sweep of the ridge trail and respond to Serpentine trailhead as soon as possible. They pressed on through the meadows, but the discovery at the Henderson vehicle had changed everything. What had seemed like routine wilderness emergencies now felt like something deliberately orchestrated, though Sarah couldn't yet imagine what or why. The trail curved around a granite outcropping and suddenly opened onto Devil's Backbone Overlook, where the Henderson family should have made their scheduled radio check-in the previous afternoon. The view was spectacular, stretching for miles across forested valleys and distant peaks, but Sarah barely noticed the scenery. Her attention was fixed on what she could see at the base of the cliff, nearly 300 feet below. "Marcus," she said quietly, pointing down into the shadows beneath the overlook. He joined her at the edge and followed her gaze to where something bright and unnatural stood out against the dark forest floor far below. Even at this distance, they could make out what appeared to be camping equipment scattered among the trees. An orange tent fly wrapped around a pine trunk, a backpack hanging from a branch, and other debris that suggested a catastrophic fall. "Could be the Henderson camp," Marcus said grimly. "We need to get down there." But accessing the base of the cliff would require a dangerous descent through unmarked terrain, and they were already hours into their search for David Reeves with no resolution. Sarah made the difficult decision to call for additional resources. "Base, this is Chen. We have a possible fatality situation at Devil's Backbone Overlook. We can see what appears to be camping equipment at the base of the cliff. We're going to need search and rescue teams and possibly body recovery assets." "Roger that. I'm dispatching county search and rescue immediately. ETA approximately 2 hours. Are you able to access the scene safely?" Sarah studied the terrain below the overlook. The cliff face was nearly vertical for the first 100 feet, then gave way to a steep slope, covered with loose rock and deadfall. An experienced climber with proper equipment might be able to make the descent, but it would be extremely dangerous, especially with weather moving in. Negative on safe access. We'll need technical rescue equipment and additional personnel. Copy. Maintain your position and continue documentation until rescue teams arrive. As they waited, Sarah and Marcus methodically photographed the scene from multiple angles, while the implications of what they were seeing sank in. If the scattered equipment below belonged to the Henderson family, it raised terrible questions about what had happened to them. The overlook had safety barriers, and Tom Henderson was an experienced hiker who would have known the dangers of getting too close to the edge. The sun reached its zenith while they worked, but the growing cloud cover was already beginning to dim the light and create the oppressive atmosphere that preceded mountain storms. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder from peaks to the west. "We should head back and check the vehicle situation," Marcus said, glancing at the darkening sky. "Storm's going to hit earlier than forecast." But as they prepared to leave the overlook, Sarah's attention was caught by something else in the valley below. Moving slowly through the trees near the scattered camping equipment was a figure, too distant to make out details, but definitely human. Someone was down there moving among the debris with what appeared to be deliberate purpose. "Marcus, look," she said, pointing toward the movement below. He followed her gaze and went very still. "That's not search and rescue." Sarah grabbed her binoculars and trained them on the figure, trying to bring it into focus through the shifting shadows of the forest canopy. What she saw made her blood run cold. A man in military-style clothing was systematically searching through the scattered camping equipment, loading items into a large backpack with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. "We need to get down there," Marcus said, But even as he spoke, they both knew it was impossible. The technical descent would take hours even with proper equipment, and the approaching storm made any attempt at cliff rescue extremely dangerous. The figure below seemed to sense their observation. He looked up toward the overlook, and even at this distance Sarah could feel the weight of his gaze. Then, with unhurried movements that suggested complete confidence in his safety, he disappeared back into the dense forest, carrying whatever he had recovered from the scattered equipment. Sarah's radio squawked again. "All units, be advised we have reports of possible poaching activity in the Blackwood Forest area. Be alert for armed individuals who may not be friendly to law enforcement contact." The pieces were beginning to form a terrifying picture. Two separate hiking parties, vanishing in the same general area. Evidence of forced entry to vehicles. Camping equipment scattered at the base of a cliff under suspicious circumstances. And now someone systematically looting the scene with military precision. "Base, this is Chen. We have visual confirmation of a suspect at the Devil's Backbone scene. Single male, military-style clothing, appeared to be removing items from the scattered equipment. Suspect has disappeared into the forest and is no longer visible." "Copy that. Description of the suspect?" Sarah realized how little useful information they had gathered. "Approximately 6 feet tall, dark clothing, carrying a large pack. Too distant for additional details." "Roger. Exercise extreme caution. County Sheriff's Department is coordinating with state police on possible organized criminal activity in your area." The first fat raindrops began to fall as they started their descent from the overlook, and within minutes, the mountain storm that had been building all morning unleashed its fury on the exposed ridge. Lightning split the sky with violent brilliance, followed immediately by thunder that shook the ground beneath their feet and echoed off the surrounding peaks like artillery fire. They moved as quickly as safely possible along the now slippery trail, but the rain quickly turned the path into a treacherous mixture of mud and running water that made every step potentially dangerous. Sarah's boots slipped repeatedly on the wet granite, and more than once she had to grab branches or rocks to keep from falling. The forest that had seemed ominous in the morning light became genuinely terrifying in the storm. Rain pounded through the canopy with the force of a waterfall, creating a constant roar that would mask the approach of any danger until it was too late. Lightning strikes illuminated the trees in stark, momentary relief, creating a strobing effect that made it difficult to judge distances or identify potential hazards. Halfway down the mountain, Marcus suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. Even over the storm noise, Sarah could hear what had caught his attention, the sound of engines somewhere below them, multiple vehicles moving through the forest on what must be old logging roads that didn't appear on any current maps. "That's not search and rescue," Marcus said grimly. "Wrong direction, wrong timing." They left the established trail and moved carefully through the forest toward the sound, using the lightning flashes to navigate between the massive tree trunks while trying to remain invisible to whoever was operating vehicles in the wilderness during a violent thunderstorm. Through the rain and wind, they caught glimpses of lights moving through the trees, not the steady beams of emergency vehicles, but the focused, directed illumination of people who were trying not to be seen. Sarah counted at least 3 separate light sources, all moving with purpose toward some predetermined destination deeper in the forest. The implications were becoming impossible to ignore. They weren't dealing with simple hiking accidents or even random criminal activity. This was organized, coordinated, and dangerous. Somewhere in the vast wilderness of Blackwood Forest, people were disappearing not by accident, but by design. And now Sarah and Marcus found themselves alone in a storm, miles from help, tracking armed individuals who had already demonstrated their willingness to harm innocent hikers. The forest that had been their sanctuary for years had become a hunting ground, and they were no longer the hunters. The storm reached its peak intensity as Sarah and Marcus tracked the mysterious lights through the forest, the thunder now so continuous that conversation was impossible without shouting. Lightning strikes were hitting the ridge above them with increasing frequency, illuminating the forest in explosive bursts that revealed the massive scale of the wilderness around them and their own terrible vulnerability within it. Moving through the dense undergrowth without established trails was exhausting and dangerous work. Every step had to be carefully placed to avoid loose rocks, hidden holes, or the tangled deadfall that could trap an ankle or worse. The rain had turned every surface slippery, and the darkness between lightning strikes was so complete that they had to rely entirely on memory and instinct to maintain their direction. The lights they were following had stopped moving about half a mile ahead, concentrated in what appeared to be a natural clearing, where the forest opened up around a seasonal creek bed. Sarah and Marcus worked their way closer, using the storm noise to mask their approach, while trying to get close enough to understand what they were witnessing. From a position behind a massive fallen cedar trunk, they could finally make out the scene that was unfolding in the clearing below. 3 military-style vehicles with covered beds were parked in a rough circle around what appeared to be a temporary camp. Armed men in camouflage clothing moved efficiently between the vehicles, loading and unloading equipment with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. But it was what Sarah saw in the center of the clearing that made her stomach clench with horror and rage. 3 figures sat bound and gagged near a guttering campfire, their faces barely visible in the shifting light, but clearly alive and terrified. Even at this distance, she could recognize the distinctive red jacket that Linda Henderson had been wearing when the family registered for their camping permit. "Jesus Christ," Marcus breathed beside her, his voice barely audible over the storm. "They're alive." The Henderson family had not fallen from Devil's Backbone Overlook. They had been taken, their campsite staged to look like an accident, while the real victims were held captive by what appeared to be a well-organized criminal operation. The scattered equipment at the base of the cliff had been a deliberate misdirection, designed to focus search efforts in the wrong area, while the real crime continued elsewhere. Sarah reached for her radio, but Marcus caught her wrist and shook his head. In the intermittent light from the camp below, she could see at least 6 armed men moving around the clearing, all of them carrying military-style weapons and moving with the disciplined coordination of trained professionals. A radio transmission now would not only reveal their position, but would likely result in the immediate execution of the hostages. One of the men below was obviously in command, directing the others with hand signals and brief, inaudible commands. He was older than the rest, with grey hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. As Sarah watched, he approached the bound prisoners and spoke to them, though the words were lost in the storm noise. Tom Henderson lifted his head to respond, and even from their concealed position, Sarah could see the defiant set of his shoulders, despite his desperate circumstances. The leader struck him casually across the face, then turned away to continue directing his men's activities, as if the assault had been nothing more than swatting an annoying insect. The operation in the clearing was clearly winding down. Equipment was being packed away, and the vehicles were being prepared for departure. Whatever these people were doing in Blackwood Forest, they were getting ready to move to a different location, possibly taking their prisoners with them, or, Sarah realized with growing horror, possibly eliminating the witnesses entirely. A new sound cut through the storm noise, the distinctive whine of helicopter rotors approaching from the east. The men in the clearing reacted immediately, extinguishing the campfire and moving to defensive positions around their vehicles with the smooth efficiency of trained soldiers. The command structure was obvious as the leader deployed his people to cover approaches while maintaining visual contact with the bound prisoners. But the helicopter sound was moving away from the clearing, heading toward Devil's Backbone Overlook, where the county search and rescue team would be attempting to reach the staged accident scene. The criminals had timed their operation perfectly, using the scattered camping equipment to draw official attention away from their actual location, while they completed whatever business had brought them to the remote wilderness. Sarah realized with sinking certainty that she and Marcus were witnessing something far more complex and dangerous than random criminal activity. This was a coordinated operation with military precision, advanced planning, and intimate knowledge of local search and rescue protocols. These people had been operating in Blackwood Forest for some time, long enough to establish procedures and contingencies that took advantage of the vast wilderness and limited law enforcement presence. The leader was speaking into what appeared to be a satellite phone, his posture suggesting he was receiving orders rather than giving them. After a brief conversation, he gestured to his men, who began loading the prisoners into one of the vehicles. The Henderson family was being moved, possibly to a more secure location, or perhaps to face a fate that Sarah didn't want to contemplate. She had to make a decision: radio for help and risk revealing their position, or attempt to follow the vehicles through unknown terrain in the middle of a violent storm with no backup and no clear plan for rescue. Every option seemed to lead to disaster, but doing nothing meant abandoning 3 innocent people to whatever fate awaited them in the hands of armed criminals. Marcus seemed to read her thoughts. He pointed toward higher ground to their east, where a rocky outcropping would provide better radio reception while maintaining visual contact with the clearing. It was a risk, but it might be their only chance to coordinate a response before the vehicles disappeared into the maze of abandoned logging roads that crisscrossed the forest. They moved carefully up the slope, using lightning flashes to navigate while trying to remain invisible to the men below. The rocky outcrop was exposed and dangerous in the storm, but it offered the elevation needed for reliable radio communication with the outside world. Sarah keyed her radio, praying that the storm wouldn't interfere with transmission. "Base, this is Chen. Emergency situation. We have visual confirmation of 3 hostages being held by armed suspects in vehicles approximately 2 miles northeast of Devil's Backbone Overlook. Suspects appear to be military trained and are preparing to move the hostages to unknown location." Static filled the channel for long seconds before Rebecca's voice came through the interference. "Chen, say again. Did you say hostages?" "Confirmed. The Henderson family is alive and being held by approximately 6 armed suspects with military-style vehicles. They staged the accident scene at Devil's Backbone to misdirect search efforts. We need immediate tactical response." "Copy that. I'm contacting State Police Tactical Team and FBI. What's your current position and status?" Before Sarah could respond, the world exploded in light and sound. A lightning strike hit the rocky outcrop less than 50 feet from their position, the electrical discharge so close that she could smell ozone and feel her hair standing on end. The thunder was instantaneous and so loud that it felt like a physical blow, leaving her ears ringing and her vision filled with purple afterimages. When her sight cleared, she realized that the lightning had illuminated their position for everyone in the clearing below. Shouts were coming from the vehicles, and she could see armed figures moving up the slope toward their location with tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. "Move!" Marcus shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the exposed rocks toward the relative cover of the forest. But the damage was done. The criminals knew they had been observed, and they were responding with lethal efficiency. Muzzle flashes began winking through the trees as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, the bullets whining off rocks and splintering tree trunks around them. Sarah and Marcus ran through the forest as branches whipped at their faces and roots tried to trip them with every step. Behind them, disciplined voices coordinated the pursuit, while flashlight beams probed the darkness searching for targets. These weren't panicked criminals fleeing from discovery. They were trained professionals, eliminating witnesses with methodical precision. The forest that had seemed so familiar during daylight had become an alien landscape of shadows and dangers. Every lightning flash revealed potential threats, while the intervals of darkness offered concealment that might mean the difference between escape and death. Sarah's lungs burned as she fought to keep pace with Marcus through terrain that seemed designed to break ankles and tear equipment from fleeing bodies. A new sound joined the pursuit, the roar of powerful engines as the vehicles began moving through the forest, their headlights sweeping between the trees like searchlights. The criminals were using their superior mobility and numbers to cut off escape routes, forcing the rangers deeper into the wilderness where rescue would be impossible and bodies might never be found. Sarah's radio crackled with desperate transmissions from the search and rescue helicopter, reporting that they had found the staged campsite, but no survivors. The pilot was requesting permission to expand the search area, unaware that the real crisis was unfolding miles away in a running gun battle between park rangers and military-trained criminals. They reached a steep creek bed that offered temporary concealment, but would be impossible to climb out of if their pursuers reached the rim. Sarah could hear voices getting closer, speaking in what sounded like professional radio terminology as they coordinated their search pattern. These men were not just criminals. They were operating with military discipline and training that suggested backgrounds in special operations or mercenary work. Marcus checked his sidearm, a standard-issue service pistol that seemed pitifully inadequate against the automatic weapons their pursuers carried. "We can't outrun them," he said grimly, "and we can't outfight them. We need to get word out about what we've seen." Sarah tried her radio again, but the storm interference and the terrain were making communication impossible. Even if she could reach base, coordinating a response would take hours, and she wasn't sure they had minutes. Then she heard something that chilled her more than the rain soaking through her clothing, the sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the west, but not the search and rescue aircraft they had heard earlier. This was a different machine, moving low and fast toward their position, with the unmistakable sound of military hardware. The criminals had air support. The realization that they were facing an organization with resources that included aircraft, trained personnel, and detailed knowledge of local law enforcement procedures made their situation seem hopeless. This wasn't random criminal activity or even organized poaching. This was something much larger and more dangerous operating in the heart of American wilderness. As the helicopter passed overhead, its searchlight began probing the forest with mechanical precision, turning night into day wherever the beam touched. Sarah and Marcus pressed themselves deeper into the creek bed as the light swept past their position, knowing that discovery would mean immediate death from above. But in the brief illumination, Sarah saw something that gave her a desperate hope. A narrow game trail led up the far side of the creek bed toward what appeared to be a cave opening in the rocky hillside. If they could reach it without being seen, they might have a chance to survive until help arrived. The helicopter moved on, its light continuing to search the forest while the ground pursuit maintained their methodical advance through the trees. Sarah and Marcus had perhaps minutes before their hiding place would be discovered, and their last chance at survival would disappear into the storm-lashed darkness of Blackwood Forest. But as they prepared to make their desperate dash toward the cave, Sarah realized that survival was no longer enough. Somewhere in the wilderness, 3 innocent people remained prisoners of an organization that had demonstrated its willingness to kill anyone who threatened their operation. Even if she and Marcus escaped, the Henderson family would disappear forever into whatever criminal enterprise had brought trained killers into the mountains. The whispers in Blackwood Forest were not the voices of ghosts or supernatural forces. They were the communications of very real and very dangerous people who had turned the wilderness into their private hunting ground. And now, surrounded by their enemies in the heart of the storm, Sarah understood that the only way to save the hostages was to become hunters themselves, using their knowledge of the forest to turn the tables on criminals who thought they owned the night.